This is a 30-year project with like four novels involved. So yeah, I'll do my best to keep it really, really simple.
Hello and welcome to the State of Shakespeare. I'm Garrett Vandermeer. Jim Elliott is not able to join us today, but joining us as our special guest today is Derek Hunter. Hello, Derek.
Hello, hello. Thank you both so much for having me on here. Very, very happy to be here. Thank you.
Derek, thanks for joining us. Derek, you are a prolific author. You've recently released a series of four novels that have to do with the creation of the Shakespeare canon and take an alternative perspective in the telling of the stories. What are the titles of these books?
So it's Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists.
Well,
And
who came up
so
with that title? I have to ask. What marketing department came up with the
yes, the Derek department came up with that. Yeah. It definitely is. For me, I feel like the beginning of not just only modern English language started during this period, during the early modern period, but it was also in many ways the modern perspective on ourselves and our place in the universe. To me, it really kind of started with the French philosopher Montaigne, who was basically a very agnostic philosopher, a very humanistic philosopher, and he really questioned everything. And he really put forth the idea like, what do I really know?
What were his dates? When was he active?
Yeah, Montaigne, he lived from 1533 to 1592. So he died in 1592. He published his essays in 1580, and he rewrote them again and again during that decade, the 80s. And then there were even editions that were published after his death in 92. But I really feel like that work was enormously influential on Shakespeare, whoever the true author was, and because I'm agnostic about it. Nietzsche once said that Montaigne's greatest reader was Shakespeare. There've been a lot of people over the centuries who've noted the similarities and perspective on human being relationships and existence between the Shakespeare canon and Montaigne. So the agnostic part came from there. And I do feel like that was also very revolutionary in terms of it did not deal with religion directly, unlike everything else at the time was dealing with religion, whether it was the Catholic version of it or the Protestant version or others, Calvinists, whatnot. Everything was about religion. And here are these great works, which are enormously secular. And they definitely have the supernatural associated with them, but they really, really do almost strikingly so chose not to deal with religion. And so there's more to it, but that's basically why I chose those, and also Anonymous, in the sense that I really felt that the true author, whoever it was anonymous, and it was not Shakespeare.
So your title, Anonymous Agnostic Antichrists, hints towards more than one author or more than one potential author.
Yes. So I really feel that whatever version, so I have four different versions. One is Thomas Sackville was the main author. Thomas Sackville was a statesman and a poet and a playwright, very powerful individual in Queen Elizabeth's court, and continued to be very powerful under King James. He wrote this one play, which is the first known play written in blank verse, Gorboduc, with Thomas Norton. So it's the first we have example of blank verse in England at the time. This was around the early 1560s. So the first book is Thomas Sackville. The second book is Thomas Watson, who was a poet and playwright from the 1580s. The third book is John Ford, who came later, more of a Jacobean Caroline playwright. And then the fourth version of the story is Amelia Lanier. So Amelia Lanier was a poet. She wrote a book of poetry, which is very feminist, very radical, extreme radical, where she argued that women are actually superior to men. And she published her book, Salve Deus, in 1611, which was the same year as the King James Bible. So I have four different versions of how it all came to be, but all four are acts of collaboration. So that's why it's the plural instead of the singular, is that whatever version that it is, even outside of my own four versions, I really feel that there was a great deal of collaboration involved.
Can any of these books be read independently of the others, or are they all dependent?
They all are independent of each other. They're basically, I would love it if people read them all, but you can just read one, and that would be a self-contained work unto itself. It's kind of like a literary Rashomon. So there was a Japanese film in the 50s directed by Akira Kurosawa, where there is this bandit who robs this husband and wife in the forest in Japan, medieval Japan. And after the incident, they are all telling their version of the story to the judge. There's in this legal case there in medieval Japan. And so you have four different versions of what happened, all four completely different from what happened. And you have the husband, the wife, the bandit, and a witness. So this is like a four different versions, a lot of the same characters, but told from each of the narrators' perceptions of how it came about, and they all claim to be the true bard.
So why four?
Well, I really feel I'm a big believer in possibilities. I really feel that it's okay to explore more than just one way of looking at things, and to see the richness and the complexity of each version is to me is worthwhile. I think it really helps to extend our look at in terms of the possibilities of the Shakespeare canon itself, in terms of looking at the plays from these different angles. Certainly, I think for stage directors, film directors, performers to look at the plays, for example, from as if it was written from the point of view of say Amelia Lanier as a woman in terms of her position, and then looking at the female characters in a different way. I definitely feel like it would add a lot to productions, performances. Then outside of that too, just in our own lives, we have so many different conflicting agendas in the world, and a lot of times it just comes to so much destruction. If we were to allow ourselves to look at the various different alternative ways of looking at things, I think it would help humanity tremendously.
This is a 30-year project. What launched you?
I first fell in love in Shakespeare in high school. In my freshman year of high school, I had a fantastic literature teacher. I fell in love with Shakespeare, also with Homer. We read the Iliad and the Odyssey. So he was just so in love with the work, and it fed off to the rest of us. And I fell in love with Shakespeare. My sophomore year of high school, I had to write a biography about Shakespeare, and I was enormously disappointed. This was around the same time I also first fell in love with James Joyce and other writers, Dostoevsky and the French poet Arthur Rimbaud. And like those three particular authors were just their biographies were fascinating. And I was just enormously disappointed with Shakespeare's biography. It was just the opposite of I thought of what it would be, and it was just so disheartening that this was the story. I mean, even T.S. Eliot, who was a banker, his life was still somewhat fascinating. And there was just so many different elements to Shakespeare's biography that I really disliked. And then I found that there was this thing called the Shakespeare Authorship Question. So there was these people since the mid 1800s who doubted that Shakespeare was the real true author, and they promoted initially it was just basically Francis Bacon, but then other alternative candidates came about, and so I went down that whole rabbit hole these last 30 years. I've looked in every single theory. I've looked in all of them. In Wikipedia, there are 80 candidates listed as being alternative Shakespeare authorship claimants, and so I've looked into them all. I've changed my mind millions of times. I'm still agnostic. I still don't know. I still don't feel like there's sufficient evidence for any of the candidates to really prove it with certainty. This was the true person. I definitely recommend it. I definitely feel like that there is so much to what was going on at that time. That was a fascinating period of time, really, truly fascinating. So the Shakespeare Authorship Question is an opportunity to explore those times in that way. But the reason was a 30-year project for me was that I told myself, I said, you know what, someday I want to do the real story of how this really came about. How did the Shakespeare canon, how did it come about? Who did it? Who was the true person? So I decided that this was something I had to do. And I had to do research. So I looked into all the different theories to try to find the right person. And it just ultimately ended up in me presenting or choosing these four are to me the equally most plausible candidates to have written the Shakespeare canon.
All four of them are equally plausible in your mind after 30 years of research.
Yes.
You don't have a front runner.
No, I mean in one day I could really make a great argument for Thomas Sackville, but then I can take a look and see Thomas Watson has a really great argument. There's just all four of them to me are really, really great, and for different reasons too. They all have different cases that for me really make a good case. And so none of them really, like clinch it for me. None of them are for sure, and that's why I have these four different possibilities.
Now, are they all equally conventional in terms of choices for potential authors?
Well, I think I don't think in terms of conventional, no, because none of these are, if you were to look and see who are the most popular alternative candidates, none of these are them. So the biggest one, of course, in the last, say, 40 years or so, 50 years, has been Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, is for sure is the most popular candidate. But he has a lot of issues. He has a lot of issues with his case. For one, the works that we have written by him are not very good. And just in terms of him already taking credit for his own work and really putting it out there, I just find it really hard to believe that he would take such an effort to hide his authorship, where we have proof that Thomas Sackville actually really did not want his name associated with poetry or especially with plays. So the publication of Gorboduc in 1565 was an authorized publication, and they published it again years later, and then apologizing to Sackville for doing such a thing. And then years later, he also just continued to just not want to be associated. So it was very clear that this was someone who did not want to have his name in the public eye attached to the public theaters or even with poetry. But in his other things too, just in terms of his ability as a poet and as a playwright is quite significant. And in terms of also, I think the big thing for me for Sackville is that he's the person who could have gotten away with it. In the 1590s, when we first see Shakespeare, he is one of the most powerful men in England. After the death of Leicester, the Earl of Leicester, who was the Queen's favorite in 1588, and also the death of Sidney, too, Philip Sidney. After that point, you really see that Thomas Sackville takes an enormously powerful position in government, in the court in England, and continues that until his death in 1608. His death in 1608 is also conveniently closely tied to why the Shakespeare sonnets would be published a year after his death in 1609. Very private, very personal sonnets which were what he was known for writing at an early point in his life. So there's a number of things that I really like about the Sackville case. There's a woman who argued brilliantly for Sackville. Her name is Sabrina Feldman. She wrote a really great book called Thomas Sackville and the Shakespeare Glass Slipper, where she has 60 attributes that show what a candidate should have in order to be the true writer. She wrote another book called The Apocryphal William Shakespeare, which were about the plays which had William Shakespeare's name on them, published at the time of his life and shortly thereafter. And there was never any argument at the time that those were his plays. And those are plays which are now considered to be not by William Shakespeare because they're just so inferior. And she makes a really good argument showing that the man from Stratford was indeed a playwright, just not a very good one. And he wrote these really bad versions of the plays, not just the ones that we consider to be part of the canon, but these other ones as well. So that's Sackville. I know I could go into all four in depth, but I don't want to take up too much time. But yeah, Sackville has a great case. Emiliani has a great case. I think the main thing about all four of them is that they were excellent writers in their own rights. And that to me is really the clincher. Like the person, whoever did this had to have been at least an excellent writer. And if you look at John Ford's plays, his plays like Perkin Warbeck or 'Tis Pity She's a Whore or The Broken Heart or The Lover's Melancholy, these four plays to me are brilliant. They are some of the best plays of the later period of the late 1620s, 1630s. If they're not masterpieces, they're definitely really close to it. Perkin Warbeck, T.S. Eliot called it to be almost like the most perfect play. It is a great history play, great story. It's just so great. So all of them. Lanier was a great poet. Her one book of poetry is excellent poetry, and Thomas Watson was an excellent poet. So I really feel like that had to be a big kicker for me, is that they had to write something in their own name that was of high quality, and then each of them having good reasons for why they would use Shakespeare's name. Thomas Watson, for me, has the best reason, just real quickly. He was supposed to, well, he died in 1592. We don't see Shakespeare's name in print, the first time we see Shakespeare's name at all is the publication in 1593, early 1593, of Venus and Adonis. So Shakespeare appears on the scene shortly after Thomas Watson's death. And this is the argument that people who argue Christopher Marlowe was the true bard. But with Thomas Watson, he had more time for some scenario like this to actually take place. So, and even there were people who talked about Shakespeare being Watson's heir. William Covell in 1595 mentioned that Shakespeare was Watson's heir, that there was so much similarity to them. In terms, if you read Watson's work in the 1580s, you definitely see a link, especially between those narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. And we do know Watson wrote plays. We know we don't have any of his plays passed down, but we do have several references by several people that he was writing plays on a daily basis. So we do know that. But yeah, so they all have their various different reasons, I think, for why they would use Shakespeare's name and why that scenario would happen.
In your mind, do you think that any of these four candidates that you propose are more likely than the conventional Bard of Avon to have been the author?
Oh yes, I actually honestly feel the man from Stratford. I feel he has one of the weakest cases for authorship. People say, well, his name is attached to the plays. Well, his name was attached to a lot of plays. There were a lot of plays that were published at the time with his name on them, which are not they're not good. They're not good plays, and they're just not worthwhile. That they're not. That's why they're called apocryphal. They're not really considered to be of much value. So I think the argument that his name is or on them that's not sufficient. With a lot of these different authors, we have to understand that at the time there was a really vibrant literary scene going on, and they all knew each other, and it was all they wrote prefaces for each other's works. John Webster would have John Ford or Thomas Middleton write something, a dedicated little piece at the beginning. There was a lot of just like it was a very active time for these authors, and we also know that it's really important. I'm not a big fan of like, well, it had to have been an aristocrat because only an aristocrat would have known anything about what it's like to live a life in the court. I think that's not a good argument. But what's really important, though, what really people have to understand is that people need to be educated. And so at that time, there was opportunities for the lower classes to be educated. Christopher Marlowe was a son of a cobbler, which was a shoemaker, and which is far below the social status of William Shakespeare, where his family came from. Where William Shakespeare came from a upper middle class on both sides of his mother's family and his father's family in Stratford. They had money. They weren't low income. Christopher Marlowe came from a low income family. Ben Jonson, his father was a bricklayer. So you have a lot of these like working class authors, but they would go on to become educated. Now you have some that were not going on to university. So most of them went on to university, whether it be Cambridge or Oxford. Marlowe went to Cambridge. John Lilly went to Oxford, and others. Ben Jonson and Thomas Kidd did not go on to university, but they did go. They were early on exposed to great education systems in London. There was the Merchant Taylor School that Thomas Lodge and Thomas Kidd and Edmund Spencer all went to. There was also Westminster, which is where Ben Jonson went to. So you have like there's a literary paper trail of education, and I really feel like it's really important people understand at this time that most people weren't literate at that time. Most people didn't read or write. Even people who were successful in their trade, they didn't necessarily have to read or write. And so it's really important to know we have to have some kind of literary paper trail to see that this person was really an author, especially not just like an average author, but we're talking about like the greatest author possibly of all time. So they really had to have some kind of exposure to education, I feel.
Well, it's a shame that Jim Elliot is not able to join us today because he would have served as a marvelous foil. You see, the problem is I'm a little bit more susceptible to this argument, perhaps, than Jim is. But I'm also happy to acknowledge that the the idea of alternative attribution has become more and more marginalized, I think, in the last decade or so. And we'll have to wait for some big revelation for the question to become mainstream again. But you're doing some heavy lifting here in putting out these texts at this time, and maybe this will rekindle some interest in the question. What is next for you, Derek Hunter, as an author?
Yes, well, for me, this will be. I've written and published 18 books, and so I've written mostly fiction, but some nonfiction as well. I definitely like to explore. I like to explore a lot of different possibilities. I like to have an open mind, and so one of the things that I do love is the tarot. And so I'm in the midst of a long project of writing 78 short stories for 78 for the 78 tarot cards. So the tarot has 78 cards, and each of the cards has like a specific meaning. So I'm taking each card and writing a story, a character who's based on those cards. So I've written the Fool, which is the first one, and also the Magician, the second one, and I will be doing the third one next year and continue on. I'm also a filmmaker. I've made some films, and it's one film called The Bitterness of Jack Henry, and just kind of like a Cassavetes style of filmmaking. I love the beauty of acting. I'm really into acting tremendously. I love Cassavetes, Robert Altman, other filmmakers. And I'm in the midst of a new project about addiction, about a woman here living in Los Angeles, following her story. So I'll be making that film as well.
From prolific beginnings to an even more prolific present and future, Derek. I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today on the State of Shakespeare.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be on here and talk about this. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for the State of Shakespeare podcast. We invite you to visit stateofshakespeare.com for more episodes, information about each of our guests, and the Shakespeare text you heard on the program, and much more. And we welcome you to join the discussion by liking us on Facebook. That's www.stateofshakespeare.com. Thanks for listening.